Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the June 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and we are resuming our reading of Karl Marx's Kapital, Volume 1 with Chapter 14, Division of Labor and Manufacture from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. Let's begin. Section 1. The Twofold Origin of Manufacture. That cooperation which is based on division of labor assumes its typical form in manufacture, and is the prevalent characteristic form of the capitalist process of production throughout the manufacturing period properly so called. That period, roughly speaking, extends from the middle of the 16th to the last third of the 18th century. Manufacture takes its rise in two ways. One, by the assemblage in one workshop, under the control of a single capitalist, of laborers belonging to various independent handicrafts, but through whose hands a given article must pass on its way to completion. A carriage, for example, was formerly the product of the labor of a great number of independent artificers, such as wheelwrights, harness makers, tailors, locksmiths, upholsterers, turners, fringe makers, glaziers, painters, polishers, gliders, etc. In the manufacture of carriages, however, all these different artificers are assembled in one building, where they work into one another's hands. It is true that a carriage cannot be gilt before it has been made, but if a number of carriages are being made simultaneously, some may be in the hands of the gilders, while others are going through an earlier process. So far, we are still in the domain of simple cooperation, which finds its materials ready to hand in the shape of people and things. But very soon, an important change takes place. The tailor, the locksmith, and the other artificers, being now exclusively occupied in carriage making, each gradually loses, through want of practice, the ability to carry on, to its full extent, their old handicraft. But on the other hand, their activity now confined in one groove, assumes the form best adapted to the narrowed sphere of action. At first, carriage manufacture is a combination of various independent handicrafts. By degrees, it becomes the splitting up of carriage making into its various detail processes, each of which crystallizes into the exclusive function of a particular worker, the manufacture as a whole being carried on by all the workers in conjunction. In the same way, cloth manufacture, as also a whole series of other manufactures, arose by combining different handicrafts together under the control of a single capitalist. And footnote, to give a more modern instance, the silk spinning and weaving of Lyon and Nîmes, quote, is entirely patriarchal. It employs a large number of women and children, but without exhausting or ruining them. It allows them to stay in their beautiful valleys of the Drôme, the Var, the Isère, the Vaucluse, cultivating their silkworms and unwinding their cocoons. It never becomes a true factory industry. However, the principle of the division of labor takes on a special character here. There do indeed exist winders, throsters, dyers, sizers, and finally weavers, but they are not assembled in the same workshop, nor are they dependent on a single master. They are all independent. That's quoting from Blanqui. Since Blanqui wrote this, the various independent laborers have, to some extent, been united in factories. And then Engels added later, since Marx wrote the above, the power loom has invaded these factories, and is now, in 1886, rapidly superseding the hand loom. The Krefeld silk industry also has its tale to tell about this subject. Back to the main text. 2. Manufacture also arises in a way exactly the reverse of this, namely by one capitalist employing simultaneously in one workshop a number of artificers who all do the same or the same kind of work, such as making paper, type, or needles. This is cooperation in its most elementary form. Each of these artificers, with the help perhaps of one or two apprentices, makes the entire commodity, and they consequently perform in succession all the operations necessary for its production. They still work in their old handicraft-like way, but very soon external circumstances cause a different use to be made of the concentration of the workers on one spot, and of the simultaneousness of their work. An increased quantity of the article has perhaps to be delivered within a given time. The work is therefore redistributed. Instead of each worker being allowed to perform all the various operations in succession, these operations are changed into disconnected, isolated ones, carried on side by side. Each is assigned to a different artificer, and the whole of them together are performed simultaneously by the cooperating workers. This accidental repartition gets repeated, develops advantages of its own, and gradually ossifies into a systematic division of labor. The commodity, from being the individual product of an independent artificer, becomes the social product of a union of artificers, each of whom performs one and only one of the constituent partial operations. The same operations which, in the case of a paper maker belonging to a German guild, merged one into the other, as the successive acts of one artificer, became in the Dutch paper manufacture so many partial operations carried on side by numerous cooperating laborers. The needlemaker of the Nuremberg Guild was the cornerstone on which the English needle manufacture was raised. But while in Nuremberg that single artificer performed a series of perhaps 20 operations one after another, in England it was not long before there were 20 needlemakers side by side, each performing one alone of those 20 operations. And in consequence of further experience, each of those 20 operations was again split up, isolated, and made the exclusive function of a separate worker. The mode in which manufacture arises, its growth out of handicrafts, is therefore twofold. On the one hand, it arises from the union of various independent handicrafts, which become stripped of their independence and specialized to such an extent as to be reduced to mere supplementary partial processes in the production of one particular commodity. On the other hand, it arises from the cooperation of artificers of one handicraft. It splits up that particular handicraft into its various detail operations, isolating and making these operations independent of one another up to the point where each becomes the exclusive function of a particular laborer. On the one hand, therefore, manufacture either introduces division of labor into a process of production or further develops that division. On the other hand, it unites together handicrafts that were formerly separate. But whatever may have been its particular starting point, its final form is invariably the same, a productive mechanism whose parts are human beings. For a proper understanding of the division of labor in manufacture, it's essential that the following points be firmly grasped. First, the decomposition of a process of production into its various successive steps coincides here strictly with the resolution of a handicraft into its successive manual operations. Whether complex or simple, each operation has to be done by hand, retains the character of a handicraft, and is therefore dependent on the strength, skill, quickness, and sureness of the individual worker in handling their tools. The handicraft continues to be the basis. This narrow technical basis excludes a really scientific analysis of any definite process of industrial production, since it is still a condition that each detail process gone through by the product must be capable of being done by hand and of forming, in its own way, a separate handicraft. It is just because handicraft skill continues, in this way, to be the foundation of the process of production that each worker becomes exclusively assigned to a partial function, and that for the rest of their life, their labor power is turned into the organ of this detail function. Secondly, this division of labor is a particular sort of cooperation, and many of its advantages spring from the general character of cooperation, and not from this particular form of it. Section 2. The detail laborer and their implements. If we now go more into detail, it is in the first place clear that a laborer who all their life performs one and the same simple operation converts their whole body into the automatic, specialized implement of that operation. Consequently, they take less time in doing it than the artificer who performs a whole series of operations in succession. But the collective laborer, who constitutes the living mechanism of manufacture, is made up solely of such specialized detail laborers. Hence, in comparison with the independent handicraft, more is produced in a given time, or the productive power of labor is increased. Footnote quoting from The Advantages of the East India Trade, London 1720, the more any manufacture of much variety shall be distributed and assigned to different artists, the same must needs be better done and with greater expedition, with less loss of time and labor. Unquote. Back to the main text. Moreover, when once this fractional work is established as the exclusive function of one person, the methods it employs become perfected. The workers' continued repetition of the same simple act, and the concentration of their attention on it, teach them by experience how to attain the desired effect with the minimum of exertion. But since there are always several generations of laborers living at one time and working together at the manufacture of a given article, the technical skill, the tricks of the trade thus acquired, become established, and are accumulated and handed down. Footnote quoting from Hodgkin's Popular Political Economy, Easy Labor is transmitted skill. Unquote. Back to the main text. Manufacture, in fact, produces the skill of the detail laborer by reproducing and systematically driving to an extreme within the workshop the naturally developed differentiation of trades, which it found ready to hand in society at large. On the other hand, the conversion of fractional work into the life calling of one person corresponds to the tendency shown by earlier societies to make trades hereditary, either to petrify them into castes, or whenever definite historical conditions beget in the individual a tendency to vary in a manner incompatible with the nature of castes, to ossify them into guilds. Castes and guilds arise from the action of the same natural law that regulates the differentiation of plants and animals into species and varieties, except that when a certain degree of development has been reached, the heredity of castes and the exclusiveness of guilds are ordained as a law of society. Footnote here, quoting from Diodorus Siculus, the arts also have in Egypt reached the requisite degree of perfection. For it is the only country where artificers may not in any way meddle with the affairs of another class of citizens, but must follow that calling alone, which by law is hereditary in their clan. In other countries it is found that tradesmen divide their attention between too many objects. At one time they try agriculture, at another they take to commerce, at another they busy themselves with 2 or 3 occupations at once. In free countries they mostly frequent the assemblies of the people. In Egypt, on the contrary, every artificer is severely punished if they meddle with affairs of state, or carry on several trades at once. Thus there is nothing to disturb their application to their calling. Moreover, since they inherit from their forefathers numerous rules, they are eager to discover fresh advantages." Unquote. Back to the main text, where we have another quote, this time from Historical and Descriptive Account of British India, etc. by Murray and Wilson, Edinburgh, 1832, with a note that the Indian loom is upright, i.e. the warp is stretched vertically. Quote, "The muslins of Dhaka in fineness, the calicoes and other piece goods of Coromandel in brilliant and durable colors have never been surpassed. Yet they are produced without capital, machinery, division of labor, or any of those means which give such facilities to the manufacturing interest of Europe. The weaver is merely a detached individual, working a web when ordered of a customer, and with a loom of the rudest construction, consisting sometimes of a few branches or bars of wood, put roughly together. There is even no expedient for rolling up the warp. The loom must therefore be kept stretched to its full length, and become so inconveniently large that it cannot be contained within the hut of the manufacturer, who is therefore compelled to ply their trade in the open air, where it is interrupted by every vicissitude of the weather." Unquote. It is only the special skill accumulated from generation to generation, and transmitted from father to son, that gives to the Hindu, as it does to the spider, this proficiency. And yet the work of such a Hindu weaver is very complicated, compared with that of a manufacturing laborer. An artificer, who performs one after another the various fractional operations in the production of a finished article, must at one time change their place, at another their tools. The transition from one operation to another interrupts the flow of their labor, and creates, so to say, gaps in their working day. These gaps close up so soon as they are tied to one and the same operation all day long. They vanish in proportion as the changes in their work diminish. The resulting increased productive power is owing either to an increased expenditure of labor power in a given time, i.e. to increased intensity of labor, or to a decrease in the amount of labor power unproductively consumed. The extra expenditure of power, demanded by every transition from rest to motion, is made up for by prolonging the duration of the normal velocity when once acquired. On the other hand, constant labor of one uniform kind disturbs the intensity and flow of a person's animal spirits, which find recreation and delight in mere change of activity. The productiveness of labor depends not only on the proficiency of the worker, but on the perfection of their tools. Tools of the same kind, such as knives, drills, gimlets, hammers, etc., may be employed in different processes, and the same tool may serve various purposes in a single process. But so soon as the different operations of a labor process are disconnected, the one from the other, and each fractional operation acquires in the hands of the detail laborer a suitable and peculiar form, alterations become necessary in the implements that previously served more than one purpose. The direction taken by this change is determined by the difficulties experienced in consequence of the unchanged form of the implement. Manufacture is characterized by the differentiation of the instruments of labor, a differentiation whereby implements of a given sort acquire fixed shapes, adapted to each particular application, and by the specialization of those instruments, giving to each special implement its full play only in the hands of a specific detail laborer. In Birmingham alone, 500 varieties of hammers are produced, and not only is each adapted to one particular process, but several varieties often serve exclusively for the different operations in one and the same process. The manufacturing period simplifies, improves, and multiplies the implements of labor by adapting them to the exclusively special functions of each detail laborer. Footnote here. Darwin, in his epoch-making work on the origin of species, remarks with reference to the natural organs of plants and animals, quote, "So long as one and the same organ has different kinds of work to perform, a ground for its changeability may possibly be found in this, that natural selection preserves or suppresses each small variation of form less carefully than if that organ were destined for one special purpose alone. Thus, knives that are adapted to cut all sorts of things may on the whole be of one shape. But an implement destined to be used exclusively in one way must have a different shape for every different use." Unquote. Back to the main text. It thus creates at the same time one of the material conditions for the existence of machinery, which consists of a combination of simple instruments. The detail laborer and their implements are the simplest elements of manufacture. Let us now turn to its aspect as a whole. Section 3. The two fundamental forms of manufacture. Heterogeneous manufacture, and serial manufacture. The organization of manufacture has two fundamental forms, which, in spite of occasional blending, are essentially different in kind, and moreover play very distinct parts in the subsequent transformation of manufacture into modern industry carried on by machinery. This double character arises from the nature of the article produced. This article either results from the mere mechanical fitting together of partial products made independently, or owes its completed shape to a series of connected processes and manipulations. A locomotive, for instance, consists of more than 5,000 independent parts. It cannot, however, serve as an example of the first kind of genuine manufacture, for it is a structure produced by modern mechanical industry. But a watch can, and William Petty used it to illustrate the division of labor in manufacture. Formerly the individual work of a Nuremberg artificer, the watch has been transformed into the social product of an immense number of detail laborers, such as mainspring makers, dial makers, spiral spring makers, jeweled hole makers, ruby lever makers, hand makers, case makers, screw makers, gilders, with numerous subdivisions such as wheel makers, brass and steel being separate, pin makers, movement makers, acheveurs de pignon, who fix the wheels on the axles, polish the facets, etc., pivot makers, planteurs de finissage, who put the wheels and springs in the works, finisseurs de barrière, who cut the teeth in the wheels and make the holes of the right size, etc., escapement makers, cylinder makers for cylinder escapements, escapement wheel makers, balance wheel makers, raquette makers, which is the apparatus for regulating the watch, the planteur d'échappement, or the escapement maker proper, then the repasseur de barrière, who finishes the box for the spring, the steel polishers, wheel polishers, screw polishers, figure painters, dial enamelers, the fabricants de pendant, who make the ring by which the case is hung, the finisseur de charnière, who put the brass hinge in the cover, etc., the faiseur de secret, who puts in the springs that open the case, the graveur, ciseleur, box polisher, etc., etc., and last of all the repasseur, who fits together the whole watch and hands it over in a going state. Only a few parts of the watch pass through several hands, and all these membra disjecta come together for the first time in the hand that binds them into one mechanical whole. This external relation between the finished product and its various and diverse elements makes it, as well in this case as in the case of all similar finished articles, a matter of chance whether the detail laborers are brought together in one workshop or not. The detail operations may further be carried on, like so many independent handicrafts as they are in the cantons of Vaud and Neufchâtel, while in Geneva there exist large watch manufactories where the detail laborers directly cooperate under the control of a single capitalist, and even in the latter case the dial, the springs, and the case are seldom made in the factory itself. To carry on the trade as a manufacture, with concentration of workers, is, in the watch trade, profitable only under exceptional conditions, because competition is greater between the laborers who desire to work at home, and because the splitting up of the work into a number of heterogeneous processes permits but little use of the instruments of labor in common, and the capitalist, by scattering their work, saves the outlay on workshops, etc. Footnote, in the year 1854, Geneva produced 80,000 watches, which is not 1/5 of the production in the canton of Neufchâtel. La Chaux-de-Fonds alone, which we may look upon as a huge watch manufactory, produces yearly twice as many as Geneva. From 1850 to 1861, Geneva produced 720,000 watches. See Report from Geneva on the Watch Trade in Reports by H.M. Secretaries of Embassy and Legation on the Manufactures, Commerce, etc., No. 6, 1863. The want of connection alone between the processes into which the production of articles that merely consist of parts fitted together is split up makes it very difficult to convert such a manufacture into a branch of modern industry carried on by machinery. But in the case of a watch, there are two other impediments in addition: the minuteness and delicacy of its parts, and its character as an article of luxury. Hence their variety, which is such that in the best London houses, scarcely a dozen watches are made alike in the course of a year. The watch manufactory of M. Vacheron and Constantin, in which machinery has been employed with success, produces at the most 3 or 4 different varieties of size and form. Back to the main text. Nevertheless, the position of this detail laborer who, though they work at home, does so for a capitalist, a manufacturer, or établisseur, is very different from that of the independent artificer, who works for their own customers. Footnote, in watchmaking, that classical example of heterogeneous manufacture, we may study with great accuracy the above-mentioned differentiation and specialization of the instruments of labor caused by the subdivision of handicrafts. Back to the main text. The second kind of manufacture, its perfected form, produces articles that go through connected phases of development, through a series of processes step by step, like the wire in the manufacture of needles, which passes through the hands of 72 and sometimes even 92 different detail workers. Insofar as such a manufacture, when first started, combines scattered handicrafts, it lessens the space by which the various phases of production are separated from each other. The time taken in passing from one stage to another is shortened, so is the labor that effectuates this passage. Footnote quoting from The Advantages of the East India Trade, in so close a cohabitation of the people, the carriage must needs be less. Unquote. Back to the main text. In comparison with a handicraft, productive power is gained, and this gain is owing to the general cooperative character of manufacture. On the other hand, division of labor, which is the distinguishing principle of manufacture, requires the isolation of the various stages of production and their independence of each other. The establishment and maintenance of a connection between the isolated functions necessitates the incessant transport of the article from one hand to another, and from one process to another. From the standpoint of modern mechanical industry, this necessity stands forth as a characteristic and costly disadvantage, and one that is immanent in the principle of manufacture. Footnote here, quoting from The Industry of Nations, 1855, the isolation of the different stages of manufacture, consequent upon the employment of manual labor, adds immensely to the cost of production, the loss mainly arising from the mere removals from one process to another. Unquote. Back to the main text. If we confine our attention to some particular lot of raw materials, of rags for instance in paper manufacture, or of wire in needle manufacture, we perceive that it passes in succession through a series of stages in the hands of the various detail workers until completion. On the other hand, if we look at the workshop as a whole, we see the raw material in all the stages of its production at the same time. The collective laborer, with one set of its many hands armed with one kind of tools, draws the wire. With another set, armed with different tools, it at the same time straightens it. With another, it cuts it. With another, points it, and so on. The different detail processes, which were successive in time, have become simultaneous. They go on side by side in space. Hence, production of a greater quantum of finished commodities in a given time. Footnote here, quoting Dugald Stewart, it, meaning the division of labor, produces also an economy of time by separating the work into its different branches, all of which may be carried on into execution at the same moment. By carrying on all the different processes at once, which an individual must have executed separately, it becomes possible to produce a multitude of pins, completely finished in the same time as a single pin might have been either cut or pointed. Unquote. Back to the main text. This simultaneity, it is true, is due to the general cooperative form of the process as a whole, but manufacture not only finds the conditions for cooperation ready to hand, it also to some extent creates them by the subdivision of handicraft labor. On the other hand, it accomplishes this social organization of the labor process only by riveting each laborer to a single fractional detail. Since the fractional product of each detail laborer is, at the same time, only a particular stage in the development of one and the same finished article, each laborer, or each group of laborers, prepares the raw material for another laborer or group. The result of the labor of the one is the starting point for the labor of the other. The one worker therefore gives occupation directly to the other. The labor time necessary in each partial process for attaining the desired effect is learned by experience, and the mechanism of manufacture as a whole is based on the assumption that a given result will be obtained in a given time. It is only on this assumption that the various supplementary labor processes can proceed uninterruptedly, simultaneously, and side by side. It is clear that this direct dependence of the operations, and therefore of the laborers on each other, compels each one of them to spend on their work no more than the necessary time, and thus a continuity, uniformity, regularity, order, and even intensity of labor of quite a different kind is begotten than is to be found in an independent handicraft or even in simple cooperation. Footnote here, quoting from the Advantages of the East India Trade, the more variety of artists to every manufacture, the greater the order and regularity of every work. The same must needs be done in less time, the labor must be less. Unquote. Back to the main text. The rule that the labor time expended on a commodity should not exceed that which is socially necessary for its production appears in the production of commodities generally to be established by the mere effect of competition, since, to express ourselves superficially, each single producer is obliged to sell their commodity at its market price. In manufacture, on the contrary, the turning out of a given quantum of product in a given time is a technical law of the process of production itself. Footnote here, nevertheless, the manufacturing system, in many branches of industry, attains this result but very imperfectly, because it knows not how to control with certainty the general chemical and physical conditions of the process of production. Back to the main text. Different operations take, however, unequal periods, and yield, therefore, in equal times, unequal quantities of fractional products. If, therefore, the same laborer has, day after day, to perform the same operation, there must be a different number of laborers for each operation. For instance, in type manufacture, there are 4 founders and 2 breakers to 1 rubber. The founder casts 2,000 type an hour, the breaker breaks up 4,000, and the rubber polishes 8,000. Here we have again the principle of cooperation in its simplest form, the simultaneous employment of many doing the same thing. Only now, this principle is the expression of an organic relation. The division of labor as carried out in manufacture not only simplifies and multiplies the qualitatively different parts of the social collective laborer, but also creates a fixed mathematical relation or ratio which regulates the quantitative extent of those parts, i.e. the relative number of laborers or the relative size of the group of laborers for each detail operation. It develops, along with the qualitative subdivision of the social labor process, a quantitative rule and proportionality for that process. When once the most fitting proportion has been experimentally established for the numbers of the detail laborers in the various groups when producing on a given scale, that scale can be extended only by employing a multiple of each particular group. Footnote here, quoting from C. Babbage on the Economy of Machinery, London, 1832, when, from the peculiar nature of the produce of each manufactory, the number of processes into which it is most advantageous to divide it is ascertained, as well as the number of individuals to be employed, then all other manufactories which do not employ a direct multiple of this number will produce the article at a greater cost. Hence arises one of the causes of the great size of manufacturing establishments. Unquote. Back to the main text. There is this to boot, that the same individual can do certain kinds of work just as well on a large as on a small scale. For instance, the labor of superintendence, the carriage of the fractional product from one stage to the next, etc. The isolation of such functions, their allotment to a particular laborer, does not become advantageous till after an increase in the number of laborers employed, but this increase must affect every group proportionally. The isolated group of laborers to whom any particular detail function is assigned is made up of homogeneous elements and is one of the constituent parts of the total mechanism. In many manufactures, however, the group itself is an organized body of labor, the total mechanism being a repetition or multiplication of these elementary organisms. Take, for instance, the manufacture of glass bottles. It may be resolved into 3 essentially different stages. First, the preliminary stage, consisting of the preparation of the components of the glass, mixing the sand and lime, etc., and melting them into a fluid mass of glass. Footnote, in England, the melting furnace is distinct from the glass furnace in which the glass is manipulated. In Belgium, one and the same furnace serves for both purposes. Back to the main text. Various detail laborers are employed in this first stage, as also in the final one of removing the bottles from the drying furnace, sorting and packing them, etc. In the middle, between these 2 stages, comes the glass melting proper, the manipulation of the fluid mass. At each mouth of the furnace there works a group, called the whole, consisting of 1 bottle maker or finisher, 1 blower, 1 gatherer, 1 putter up or wetter off, and 1 taker in. These 5 detail workers are so many special organs of a single working organism that acts only as a whole, and therefore can operate only by the direct cooperation of the whole 5. The whole body is paralyzed if but one of its members be wanting. But a glass furnace has several openings, in England from 4 to 6, each of which contains an earthenware melting pot full of molten glass, and employs a similar 5-membered group of workers. The organization of each group is based on division of labor, but the bond between the different groups is simple cooperation, which, by using in common one of the means of production, the furnace, causes it to be more economically consumed. Such a furnace, with its 4 to 6 groups, constitutes a glass house, and a glass manufactory comprises a number of such glass houses, together with the apparatus and workers requisite for the preparatory and final stages. Finally, just as manufacture arises in part from the combination of various handicrafts, so too it develops into a combination of various manufactures. The larger English glass manufacturers, for instance, make their own earthenware melting pots because, on the quality of these depends, to a great extent, the success or failure of the process. The manufacture of one of the means of production is here united with that of the product. On the other hand, the manufacture of the product may be united with other manufactures, of which that product is the raw material, or with the products of which it is itself subsequently mixed. Thus, we find the manufacture of flint glass combined with that of glass cutting and brass founding, the latter for the metal settings of various articles of glass. The various manufactures so combined form more or less separate departments of a larger manufacture, but are at the same time independent processes, each with its own division of labor. In spite of the many advantages offered by this combination of manufactures, it never grows into a complete technical system on its own foundation. That happens only on its transformation into an industry carried on by machinery. Early in the manufacturing period, the principle of lessening the necessary labor time in the production of commodities was accepted and formulated, and the use of machines, especially for certain simple first processes that have to be conducted on a very large scale and with the application of great force, sprang up here and there. Footnote, this can be seen from William Petty, John Bellers, Andrew Yarrington, The Advantages of the East India Trade, and J. Vanderlyn, not to mention others. Back to the main text. Thus, at an early period in paper manufacture, the tearing up of the rags was done by paper mills, and in metalworks the pounding of the ores was effected by stamping mills. Footnote, toward the end of the 16th century, mortars and sieves were still used in France for pounding and washing ores. Back to the main text. The Roman Empire had handed down the elementary form of all machinery in the water wheel. Footnote, the whole history of the development of machinery can be traced in the history of the corn mill. The factory in England is still a mill. In German technological works of the first decade of this century, the term Mühle is still found in use not only for all machinery driven by the forces of nature, but also for all manufactures where apparatus in the nature of machinery is applied. Back to the main text. The handicraft period bequeathed to us the great inventions of the compass, of gunpowder, of type printing, and of the automatic clock. But on the whole, machinery played that subordinate part which Adam Smith assigns to it in comparison with division of labor. Footnote, as will be seen more in detail in the 4th book of this work, Adam Smith has not established a single new proposition relating to division of labor. What, however, characterizes him as the political economist par excellence of the period of manufacture is the stress he lays on division of labor. The subordinate part which he assigns to machinery gave occasion in the early days of modern mechanical industry to the polemic of Lauderdale, and at a later period to that of yore. Smith also confounds differentiation of the instruments of labor, in which the detail laborers themselves took an active part, with the invention of machinery. In this latter, it is not the workers in manufactories, but learned men, handicraftsmen, and even peasants, such as Brindley, who play a part. Back to the main text. The sporadic use of machinery in the 17th century was of the greatest importance, because it supplied the great mathematicians of that time with a practical basis and stimulant to the creation of the science of mechanics. The collective labor, formed by the combination of a number of detail laborers, is the machinery specially characteristic of the manufacturing period. The various operations that are performed in turns by the producer of a commodity and coalesce with one another during the progress of production lay claim to it in various ways. In one operation it must exert more strength, in another more skill, in another more attention, and the same individual does not possess all these qualities in an equal degree. After manufacture has once separated, made independent, and isolated the various operations, the laborers are divided, classified, and grouped according to their predominating qualities. If their natural endowments are, on the one hand, the foundation on which the division of labor is built up, on the other hand, manufacture, once introduced, develops them in new powers that are by nature fitted only for limited and special functions. The collective laborer now possesses, in an equal degree of excellence, all the qualities requisite for production, and expends them in the most economical manner, by exclusively employing all its organs, consisting of particular laborers, or groups of laborers, in performing their special functions. Footnote here quoting from Babbage, the master manufacturer, by dividing the work to be executed into different processes, each requiring different degrees of skill or of force, can purchase exactly that precise quantity of both which is necessary for each process. Whereas, if the whole work were executed by one worker, that person must possess sufficient skill to perform the most difficult, and sufficient strength to execute the most laborious of the operations into which the article is divided. Unquote, back to the main text. The one-sidedness and the deficiencies of the detail laborer become perfections when they are a part of the collective laborer. Footnote, for instance, abnormal development of some muscles, curvature of bones, etc. Back to the main text. The habit of doing only one thing converts them into a never-failing instrument, while their connection with the whole mechanism compels them to work with the regularity of the parts of a machine. Footnote, the question put by one of the inquiry commissioners, how the young persons are kept steadily to their work, is very correctly answered by Mr. William Marshall, the general manager of a glass manufactory. Quote, they cannot well neglect their work. When once they begin, they must go on. They are just the same as parts of a machine. Unquote. Back to the main text. Since the collective laborer has functions, both simple and complex, both high and low, its members, the individual labor powers, require different degrees of training, and must therefore have different values. Manufacture, therefore, develops a hierarchy of labor powers, to which there corresponds a scale of wages. If on the one hand the individual laborers are appropriated and annexed for life by a limited function, on the other hand the various operations of the hierarchy are parceled out among the laborers according to both their natural and their acquired abilities. Footnote, Dr. Yore, in his Apotheosis of Modern Mechanical Industry, brings out the peculiar character of manufacture more sharply than previous economists, who had not his polemical interest in the matter, and more sharply even than his contemporaries such as Babbage, who, though much his superior as a mathematician and mechanician, treated mechanical industry from the standpoint of manufacture alone. Yore says, quote, this appropriation to each, a worker of appropriate value and cost, was naturally assigned, forms the very essence of division of labor, unquote. On the other hand, he describes this division as, quote, adaptation of labor to the different talents of men, unquote. And lastly, characterizes the whole manufacturing system as, quote, a system for the division or gradation of labor, as, quote, the division of labor into degrees of skill, unquote, etc. Back to the main text. Every process of production, however, requires certain simple manipulations, which every person is capable of doing. They too are now severed from their connection with the more pregnant moments of activity, and ossified into exclusive functions of specially appointed laborers. Hence manufacture begets, in every handicraft that it seizes upon, a class of so-called unskilled laborers, a class which handicraft industry strictly excluded. If it develops a one-sided specialty into a perfection at the expense of the whole of a person's working capacity, it also begins to make a specialty of the absence of all development. Alongside of the hierarchic gradation, there steps the simple separation of the laborers into skilled and unskilled. For the latter, the cost of apprenticeship vanishes. For the former, it diminishes compared with that of artificers, in consequence of the functions being simplified. In both cases, the value of labor power falls. Footnote, quoting Yore, each handicraftsman being enabled to perfect himself by practice in one point became a cheaper worker, unquote. Back to the main text. An exception to this law holds good whenever the decomposition of the labor process begets new and comprehensive functions that either had no place at all or only a very modest one in handicrafts. The fall in the value of labor power, caused by the disappearance or diminution of the expenses of apprenticeship, implies a direct increase of surplus value for the benefit of capital, for everything that shortens the necessary labor time required for the reproduction of labor power extends the domain of surplus labor.